right, so our next talk today, this is the final talk for the ICS track before we go into our keynote to close. We have a couple gentlemen from Idaho National Labs. We've got Gabriel Weaver, who is a senior critical infrastructure analyst, and Scott Bowman, who is a controls analyst for Idaho National Labs. So off to you guys. So please welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam. So I'm Scott Bowman. This is Gabe Weaver. We're going to kind of hand it back and forth. But we just really wanted to bring back to the people here what we had harvested from communications between industry partners over the last 2 years and a program that you may be familiar with, Coyote. One of the things that kind of trickled to the top was trying to understand what's normal and what's not. And that always comes back around to baselining, right? So people understanding what's normal specifically in industrial control systems is always a challenge because of different knowledge, because of different experience levels, how long you've been at the location you've been working, the different facilities. So Gabe really took the lead here and came up with this concept and wanted to really stretch the capabilities of what baselinings could look like within across all critical infrastructure sectors. So, Gabe, you want to introduce yourself and take that a little bit further?
Yeah, so hi, my name's Gabe Weaver. I'm an infrastructure analyst at Idaho National Lab, and a lot of this is very much industry-driven from the get-go. The whole purpose for the idea, like Scott was saying, was due to industry engagement and webinars, and we want to take that to the next level and get more involved. And before we even proceed with the research further, make sure our assumptions are correct. And part of that is people talk about baselines, but can you actually construct baselines? And are there specific processes for which it's not feasible to construct baselines, or specific scales at which it's not possible to construct baselines? So is that better? All right, good. So anyway, the whole point is to understand what's possible and what's not possible with baseline construction. And so kind of motivating it, and Scott will walk through that.
And I'm going to cut back on that back and forth after these first two slides. So this is what we see in the landscape right here. We have the 16 critical infrastructure sectors, and that's what our research focuses on. And we really expanded. We are a DOE lab, but we expanded to look outside of the energy sector. And what really started to come to the top was the IT/OT kind of landscape was expanding and complexity was increasing over the last 20 years. And so we've developed these different frameworks to approach that, right? And one that's common is NIST, right? You have NIST, you've got MITRE, all these things that help people wrap their heads around what's going on in their environments. And so one of the programs that the lab has been working on since 2016 is Coyote. And it's really an event classification methodology. What's going on in your environment, how do you communicate about it, how do you recognize things, perceive and comprehend, and make decisions that are better about what you should do with the risk that you see. And so through our conversations with industry partners, baselining was always one that came to the top. And so, Gabe, if you go to the next one, this is what happens, right? So when you work with the lab, we have a process, right? It goes from an idea, and what we really want to do is go through this process of an idea, applied research, then we create some kind of tool, some kind of technology, something that we need to demonstrate at various scales so that we can get that technology, the new approach, whatever it is, into your hands and make sure that it is industry supporting and it's industry improving technology. So there's value in it from the get-go, and it's not something that we create and it becomes shelfware, right, that no one uses. So right now, we're at about the idea, between the idea and the research, right? So that means we've got a good idea, we've got industry giving us thumbs up, and so Gabe is going to take you through what we think and when we need partners to take our this process through to the point where we have a new tool to manage what we call micro baselines, and Gabe's going to go into that in detail. But I just want you to understand that what we're doing is trying to scale this and tell you what you may not have the resources or the capabilities, or it's too risky to test these kind of things. And so that's why the labs exist. And we really want to give you something that improves your workforce and reduces the cost of doing baselines. And what does that scale look like? So Gabe, go ahead, and I'll stop handing it back and forth.
Right. So some of the value to industry that we really want to be able to provide is this idea of a micro baseline. Is my microphone all right? Okay, good. It's echoing a little for me. So that's the whole point, is that we want to be able to profile expected behavior, not just of technology, not just of how things are implemented, but with respect to a particular process, an operational process. And the idea is by raising that level of abstraction, we're then able to compare things over time, integrate additional data sources. So if you're constructing a baseline, we're not just looking at profiling a network or understanding an asset or a device. We want to be able to integrate that relative to a very specific context and process, and then be able to understand where does this generalize or where does it not generalize. And so that's the kind of approach we're thinking about. One thing about operational technology systems versus IT is we think it's a more constrained environment because you're supporting a very specific process. And so maybe those constraints would make it feasible to actually construct these baselines in a more precise manner. Some of these other points is we want to be able to integrate data sources across multiple organizational silos. So you can see on the right-hand side of this diagram, may have a facility, it's a vertical separator, and maybe that operational process varies seasonally. And so I want to be able to construct a baseline for winter of 2023, and it's in green, it's performing well, but I'm not really sure over what lifespan that baseline is actually going to be effective. And so we really need these baselining management tools. That's the proposed novelty, and that's something we're here today to validate or refute. Would micro baselining management tools be useful to industry? It would allow one to inventory data source dependencies for profiling very specific operational processes. You'd also then be able to identify informational single points of failure, where if you don't trust a data source, then you know this is going to affect my baseline. How much redundancy do I have in my different data sources? That's really important to know, I think, with data integrity attacks, for example. You want to be able to manage these multi-version baselines because there's an evolving context. It could be environmental. It could be maintenance results in a configuration change. It could be all kinds of different things of context that may be traditionally outside of what we model. We're trying to make those factors more explicit and use techniques to understand what parts of that context actually are relevant, right? So there's no guarantees you can always construct a baseline. One of the earlier talks, you may not even have visibility, but can we have the conversation where it's like, this would be really nice to be able to baseline. Here's how we can get the visibility. Here are the features that are useful. That's kind of where we're going. And of course, if we can understand normal or even how often normal changes, we can kind of calibrate our expectations for whether or not we can detect anomalous behavior or not, because things probably aren't going to stay the same throughout. If they change every week, you can't really construct a great baseline. If they persist for multiple months, you have a chance. So that's kind of the direction and things that we're thinking about. Scott, did you want to add anything? All right, gonna keep going. What the heck do we mean by context? This is a current thought about it, and it's up for discussion, which is why we're glad some of you came out tonight. You can see on the left a map of a region, so that's one notion of context. In Texas, Louisiana, we have an all hazards analysis tool that allows us to basically map out geospatially different types of infrastructure. Here we've tailored it just for Texas and Louisiana. You can see if you zoom in on one of these nodes, they represent facilities. Potentially I'm at a company and there's two facilities that are quite similar, facility 1 and facility 2. In addition to additional context and multiple versions of baselines I may want to manage. And so I say, okay, we're in April 2021. And again, this is beating a dead horse maybe, but it's saying, well, we need a way to manage these multiple versions and understand how these things may change. And so if you kind of think out, we have a lot of research at the lab at Idaho National Laboratory. We have that whole national lab complex. And it covers a variety of different aspects of this notion of context that we're talking about. So on the far left-hand side, you see these different notions. People would say computer systems, devices, and networks. That's mainly where we're inhabiting it as a community. But then there's also the process side of things. You have physical sensors and gauges. You have people that live and breathe that process literally every day. And you can see what we think is the current OT baselines. There's that IT-OT convergence push. To what extent is that possible? From a research question, I think that's still open. If you focus on devices and network traffic, then current OT baseline is trying to make sense of that. And even within that, there's acknowledged gaps in industry based on some of our research. But then also, if you can, also with respect to engineering, there's sensors and gauges. One of the things we're doing at INL, though, is augmenting that information with practitioner information. So you can't measure everything, you can't boil everything down to a number. Practitioners that are in these facilities are able to smell things, are able to see things, have intuitions. And so there's the Optic app by Coyote that allows them to take these qualitative, maybe more qualitative types of impressions and log them. And because we've kind of raised the level of abstraction from computer systems and technology to processes, we can now fuse that information that's more qualitative about the process along with more technical types of information that you're maybe traditionally see in baselining. And the idea is, that's kind of the idea with micro baselines on the far right-hand side of that slide, is can we raise that level of abstraction across the entire life cycle of a process? But then also, is it possible to incorporate other sources of information, more geographic? What kind of baselines can you construct at different geographic scales? These are all things we want to explicitly explore, and we're going to talk about more in depth about how we think we can do that. And we want to see, does that actually hold up to what industry thinks or not? And so we want industry partners to make sure this actually will work if industry thinks it can work. And we're also open to getting negative results as well. That's one of the luxuries of being at a national lab, right? So we can say, this is not possible to baseline currently because of X, Y, and Z, and we can provide that feedback as well and maybe try to address that as well. So one type of industry partnership that we want, you saw that on the blue dashed lines that Scott opened up with on that back and forth between lab and industry. We want data profile exchanges. What the heck does that mean? Data profile exchange. So back in the day, we would do webinars and provide presentations and get feedback. That was one form. Now we're going to get more specific and talk about what types of data sources do you have out at actual facilities or within your testing environments, and to what extent can we harmonize that with the types of data sources and data features that we use at the lab. And so we don't want access to the actual testing facilities. We don't want access to actual operational resources. We want to follow the principle of least privilege and say, what do we need for baselining? And what that says is that we need to understand what features are available to us and to industry to be able to construct very specific baselines for a given process. Right, so maybe on the left here at the lab, we have Cellar, which across different critical infrastructure sectors provides an environment to be able to understand. Basically, it's a small scale model of what would occur in a physical process, but it's combined with an HMI and some of these other types of networks so we can understand kind of cyber-physical interactions. One thing that's nice about this capability is maybe events that are more rare in industry, we can generate more of and get a more balanced data set to be able to try to train and understand whether we can construct baselines or not for a given process. And then one of the things with the National Lab Complex is we have these very large, vast tracts of land with actual facilities on them as well. So we have everything ranging from these small things to these large scale actual power grid systems in one case, and everything in between. So we can do things like digital twins and virtualization to try to bridge that gap. And so what the goal is, we got a data profile idea for a process we want to baseline. That process is motivated by interaction with industry. Industry may have additional data sets. For example, human operators. We don't have someone who's spent the last 15 years in front of the Cellar skid, no, it's a skid, right? But people do live and breathe in that facility and understand it. So is it possible, using just the data sources that are available to us, to compare the features, kind of the attributes across these different data sources, and then maybe the range of values one might expect? Are those comparable or are they not? That's the first step of what do we mean by a micro baseline. Scott, did you have anything? Okay. If we want to dive in a little bit more, we've done some previous engagements and talks with industry. Where a baseline's currently at. Currently, they're heavily asset focused. So we're focused on appliances, devices, things provided by vendors. But how do these things compose up into the process overall? That's kind of the question that we want to be able to answer. We need to integrate network and device data. A lot of people have said that's an acknowledged industry gap. So if you remember that diagram on the far left, there was computer systems in the lower left and went all the way up to geographic type of stuff. Even if you just stick in that particular type of context, there's a gap there, right? Can we integrate this information? Furthermore, people want to be able to integrate operational data, right, with the Security Operations Center type of information as well. So there's research that's done where you can integrate Pi Historian with network captures and understand that. That's still emerging research. And we're still just in that one bucket of context. What we want to be able to do is integrate different data profiles with information sources ranging from sensors and gauges, people, and we think that'll increase redundancy in the types of information we're able to get about a process. For example, on that right-hand side, the last feature you see, that's HMI interactions. You can get human operators as well as device and network. Those are two types of data sources that would provide you information about HMI interactions, right? So if you don't trust one of those data sources, you have another to fall back on. You can also correlate between the two. That's the idea anyway. But if you do this, you're gonna get a whole slew of different types of features and attributes, and how do you sift through those? So you can use SME intuition, but you can also back that up with different types of machine learning algorithms. And I hesitate to say that because it's such a buzzword, but that's true. You can use different types of machine learning algorithms to be able to verify or refute different types of SME intuitions. And we think we can fuse different types of data sets via ontologies and language grammars, but we think there's real value there. Scott, do you want to talk about?
I'll talk about that because this is overarching across more than just Gabe's work. At the lab, we have a lot of different sources of research, and they end up creating little fiefdoms of really intelligent people creating things, right? And it's hard to understand maybe some of the great things that people pull out of one area of research and how it may be relevant to another. And so fusion of data sets. Some people are a little afraid of sharing data, and so one of the ways to do that is to create a level of abstraction above it. That's why everybody is okay with sharing maybe some metadata. And the ontology makes it capable of different people with different knowledge sets to talk about the same problem. So we're taking this approach so that if someone's talking about a feature of a micro baseline, we can hone in on that and understand how these two different groups or users may communicate differently about it, but then get to a point where they understand what's normal, right? And that's really hard to do even within our research facility, let alone working with industry partners who are from all different backgrounds, with all different knowledge sets. So that's why we believe this is very worth our time and worth the partnership with industry, because the horizon of normal changes so frequently. And so, and again, I want to really highlight the targeted threat hunt. So what I see Gabe's work and any work that comes out of a partnership with industry is you are going to be able to identify what your scope should be more rapidly before you start investigating, right? At least you can get from general to specific in a much shorter time. And so that's what we mean by targeted threat hunts. And if that prevents, even an hour or half an hour of downtime, I know that means it's a lot of money in any industry in this region right here. So that's why we're really hoping to get a lot of conversations around this. I know it's late in the conference, but we really we want people to reach out to us and really question our approaches and say, hey, I think this might really be something, because we believe there are a lot of informational single points of failure out there, and you probably know them maybe off the top of your head, right? And so maybe you can cut back on some of the time we spend researching, and we can really focus our research on those key points. So that's why we think this approach is going to be great, because we will abstract at a higher level, and people will probably be more trusting because it's not raw data. So that's our approach, and that's all I wanted to add to Gabe.
Thanks, Scott. The other kind of neat thing that just occurred to me is you raise that level of abstraction. It's also a communication tool. So maybe you're able to better communicate with non-technical folks as well, because you're now talking about process rather than just assets and traffic and things like that. So it could be a potential communication mechanism within the organization as well. Another type of partnership, you saw another blue arrow up at those earlier slides, was algorithm evaluations. So let's say we develop a really cool algorithm in the lab. Will it survive the ivory tower? We don't know. So it'd be really nice to be able to say, okay, we have an algorithm. We know that we have comparable features with respect to our data profile. We don't want access to your systems, but what do you think of this algorithm? We could even just give you pseudocode for the algorithm, right? Or if you're okay, an implementation. You could try that, and we could then evaluate its performance and say, does this work well or not? And if the performance varies, we can have a conversation about why it's not working, right? So this is one of these questions, like, to what extent do these baselines actually generalize? It's not very clear. And so maybe this is a structured approach to start to answer that question, because it's still a problem that needs to be solved. It may not generalize to the extent that, like, great scientists necessarily want to, right? But it's very practical and important to be able to do that. Yep. Right. Yeah, so to be fair, this is early stage research. There's no format. There's some things we had in mind, right? So we have ontologies, and those are usually backed by like a format like OWL. It's a controlled vocabulary. But you could just namespace out your attributes and then map your data sources in through like something like even a JSON. I prefer something you could actually validate, right, as a format, and maybe you could compose different schema for different types of data source, but Scott's itching for...
Yeah, so right now we're just working with a warehouse that INL's developed, right? An ontology-based data warehouse where it needs to be in a certain type of data format, and the ones that are most common are JSON-based, right? So you have sticks. You can actually do baselining in sticks, and some of our other research makes it possible where we can have machine-to-machine communication about what your baseline is, what it has been in the past, and have very good controlled versioning of your baselines. And once we determine which components of your data, the metadata even, or the context, or whatever level you want to go to, we can start to map that over time and have a very, very good like slice of your data, whatever attributes you care about. So. Right. Yeah, so I think, is it the next slide? Is it the life cycle management? Is that, yeah. Yeah, so thank you for the question, but so we haven't really decided on a format, right? And we're trying to keep it at that level right now because we don't want to get ahead of the partnership, right? Because we want it to be something that is widely shareable, right? Some people like sticks, some people don't like sticks, right? Like, but usually people want that can go into their SIM, right? Like at a minimum. So JSON and sticks both work with SIMs, and but we're also looking at potential ways to get this understanding of what's normal, not just in the security operations, but at the business process level, right? So you can actually communicate business requirements, and it's just to show value just out of cybersecurity mindsets, right? It's like, oh, you're telling me something about my system that may improve maintenance, it may improve our life cycle management. That's what he's going to get to, and it's really based upon the systems engineering life cycle. You'll see that in CCE and CIE. A lot of it comes through that design to operation and maintenance, and then once you get to decommissioning, this is how we see baselining is probably going to have to follow and trail that, so that it seems much more like another operational process rather than some niche like cybersecurity thing where you got a bunch of PCAPs and everybody's like, okay, thanks for that. There's just not enough context. There's always another question, right? Like, well, where did this PCAP come from, and where, like, who did it? And all of this context, it just has to, it's an onion that never ends. And so from the last few years, we just looked at historical cyber attacks in OT environments. And we had a panel of people that were evaluating the events in sequence. And we were saying, how normal is this? Like, would you ever see this in normal traffic? Say it's a C2 technique from MITRE. Well, I would see HTTP like constantly. And so that's like a microsecond of like normal activity, but it just looks like every other thing. So all that to say is that it was really hard to define, even amongst people that were just focused on this, what normal was, even when you know it's bad. Like, you're looking at it and like, I literally know that's bad traffic, but still it looks the same. So the question of normalcy was always this debate that would last for weeks sometimes. So this is really what we're trying to get to, is what's the best way to abstract it kind of outside of the cyber domain, so it becomes something that engineering people can be a part of, business process leaders and decision makers can be a part of, and to where it becomes like less intangible as an asset, right? Because there's value in it, but it's hard to realize, and that's what we're trying to make it visible. So I'll let Gabe get back to it, though. I hope that answers your question.
All right. Gonna keep going, but if you have questions, please. Right. So this is a good segue for the next slide, where things change over time. So you need to be able to manage baselines over time, right? So this is actually a quote from Scott. We were talking on Teams, and we were like, like micro baselining management tools should reflect the asset and operations life cycle, right? So here's an example. Let's start with this facility. It's in April 2021. There's a separator process. This box, it's a micro baseline, and it is green because it's performing pretty well at this point in time. But maybe due to data drift and other things, it starts to perform worse, let's say in August, and so it's red. It doesn't mean you necessarily have to throw that baseline away, right? It may be useful, but there may be seasonal aspects to the business where you bring it back later in the year and it works but fine, right? So we want to be able to have these management tools, and we think this is a question. Would this be useful to have these management tools for baselines, to curate these different types of baselines, to be able to understand over time, how does your process change? And maybe are there cyclic aspects of your process that people understand intuitively, but you could actually explicitly express that or demonstrate that using this approach here. Yep.
So another reason why this is an interesting use case is looking back at some of the historical attacks. One specifically comes to mind, Trisis or Triton, if you're familiar with it, Hatman. How could you baseline the decision to just turn off the alarm, like ignore the alarm? How would you know if that's normal or if that's just, policy drift? Who knows what it is, right? So there's pieces of context that you won't be able to get even if you are suspecting that a firmware is bad, right? Like if you didn't check the hash of the firmware, if you're seeing strange communications from your safety system, like how would you know if you weren't taking into more concern other contextual pieces, like your policy about safety systems, and is it in program mode, or is it in run mode, or is it always in program mode? So some of those pieces of information only come out whenever you question some of the decisions that people are making, not necessarily technology. So it makes sense that the baseline and the life cycle of your policies and your operational process, how you operate normally, have to be taken into consideration. And most of those are at the operator, non-cyber people are making those decisions. So I think this approach is really key just from that specific example, because most of them look like normal administration, like these attacks look like normal administration, and then things get bad really fast. So that's one of the things that I really think is great about this, is that you could also see drift in the life cycle. Like if you had two separator processes that were similar or close to being similar, you could monitor the life cycle and say, this one's drifting, why is it drifting? And maybe it's degrading faster than the other. There is an approach in persistence theory where you don't need to create a big explosion, you just have to cause that person to not operate optimally. But it would just look like a life cycle problem, and you wouldn't understand why. And there are plenty of examples in some of the historical attacks of that happening. So I think this is going to be one of those things where you're going to have to ask more questions, and the way we want to do data profiles will make it so you have to ask less questions, and you're getting that context up front. So that's what I wanted to add to that.
Right, so here's some examples, other potential use cases, I guess, for micro baselining. Let's say you have a facility and you have a good handle on how that facility is operating, and that particular process is baselined. And you have a very similar facility using your company's proprietary algorithm, and you want to see, can I transfer this baseline over to a very similar facility? Does this actually generalize or not? So in theory, you can check the data profile. You can say, okay, the features that we're looking at are pretty similar, and the ranges of value seem similar, so let's try this proprietary algorithm that we developed. And so within the own company, you can actually then evaluate the performance, right? And you say, okay, the performance on this at this facility is fair, and that's maybe surprising because we thought they were very similar. And you can start to dig in, well, how are they different, and why are they different? Are there any, we were expecting them to be that different, and have a conversation that's very data-driven. And you may have someone that you're a competitor with, but you want to improve the overall ecosystem. You don't want to share your proprietary baselining algorithm, but you do want to have a common language to talk about different types of features that you observe across a variety of data sources. And so you share that data profile out with another company with a similar type of facility, and you can, maybe build up a common language for discussing these processes that you want to baseline in that manner. So two different types of sharing, inter-facility and then inter-organizational. And then there's another one if you're going up that scale to geographic scale, you could do within the whole region. How comparable is the behavior of region-wide processes across different geographic areas, and start to look at that as well. It may not all be necessarily bottom up. It may just be you're baselining at a regional level and be able to compare across those as well. But this is kind of what we think there's some additional value that we could bring to bear here. And so Scott.
I'll close it out. So I just want everyone to understand that what we're looking for are great questions like we had. That was a great question. And we're looking for people that are interested in testing different approaches that they may not have ever tested before, right? And working with us to make sure that we're asking the right questions and that our questions aren't just ivory tower questions. You may have a test environment or a development environment that you are pre-production, right? We don't want to get into your production environments, as no matter what anybody says about what we do out at the lab, we are not interested in getting into your environment at all. We want to work with you at the development and demonstration level, and we want to help build out what are the scales of demonstration that are necessary so that we can get a tool that works for you in your hands. And so finally, we want to be able to create exercises that are highly relevant and scalable to whatever keeps you up at night, basically, and be able to really define normal and not normal, and then this could result in catastrophic or region-wide, whatever kind of failures, cascading failures. And so we really want to have a body of knowledge that is shareable and something that is transferable to the workforce, because that's really what it comes down to at the end of the day, is getting this into the hands of people that make decisions and need support in their environment. So again, I just want to remind you, you will help us drive the requirements for our research, and we need trusted partners, right? And industry makes it a reality. So that's what we came here to talk to you about. Gabe, do you have anything else? No? I think the diamond. How could I forget? So some of you may be familiar with other things, not just micro-baselining. So Coyote, I mentioned. CyberChamp is a workforce development and analysis tool. And then the OT Defender Fellowship is another program where we can partner with you and do like an exchange program at the lab. And then some of the things that we've put out that the lab supported were governance focused, the National Cyber Informed Engineering strategy that the DOE put out. That's something that I would highly recommend y'all take a look at. And C2M2 is a cybersecurity capability maturity model that we're going to be integrating most of the things up here into, so that, you know, Coyote has the Optic app, which is literally puts Coyote in your hand, and a little bit of NIST and C2M2 into your hand. So starting to build those lower level contexts that would be relevant to your environment. And we have Malcolm, which, if you're familiar with what the lab puts out, that's a sensor that helps map your OT environment. And Core 2 is the future. And so the ontology-based warehouse, Core 2 is going to be the platform that helps us identify what are the proper formats, how can we cross-correlate between different data sets. We do not, I have to say it a million times, we do not want anybody's data. We will want to understand the structure of your data so that we know what are the features that are important to you. And then we can model and simulate that so that we can get to the point of developing a valuable algorithm for these kinds of efforts. So that's kind of, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention CCE. And we also have workshops that facilitate like week-long workshops that help facilitate understanding consequence-driven cyber-informed engineering. And we also have full-blown partnerships that last for I think months and even years once the partnership's established. And that is really about the design process of protections, right? So how do you design into secure by design controls for your controlled processes? So that's really some of the research that's going on, and this is what we want. We want programmatic enablement of industry and our research efforts. So next, anything else? Yeah, we had a booth. It was next to ICS Village, but we would love for y'all to come talk to us. And if you're listening out there, please go check out or contact us at coyote@inl.gov. So, thank you.